She was never meant to be a citizen of Britain. She was meant to be British. The living symbol of it. The face on the coins, the head on the stamps, the name inside the anthem. Not a woman who happened to live in the country. The woman who was in the country. So when the largest financial leak in history spilled open, and reporters started reading the pages one by one, a single line stopped them cold. Millions of pounds of the Queen's own private fortune had been quietly moved offshore. Not into Britain, out of it. To the Cayman Islands, to Bermuda. And buried in that mountain of paper was one small holding, one specific investment, sitting several steps away from her. Something she almost certainly never chose, never signed for, and never saw, that turned a dry accounting story into a moral one. Because of what that particular company was accused of doing to the poorest people in her own kingdom. That's the box I'm going to open for you. Not yet, but stay with me, because it is not what most people assume. Let me rewind, because you have to understand how strange this event is before you can feel why it landed the way it did. For most of her reign, the Queen's money was a kind of polite mystery. Everyone understood there was wealth. Palaces, estates, art, land that had belonged to the crown for centuries. But the details were kept behind a curtain, and by long tradition, nobody was really supposed to look too hard. The monarch's private finances were treated almost the way her private thoughts were, off limits, dignified, none of your business. That was the arrangement. That was the deal the whole thing quietly ran on. Then, in November of 2017, that curtain caught fire. A vast trove of documents leaked out of an offshore law firm and a set of corporate service providers. 13.5 million files, reported on by journalists all over the world. They called it the Paradise Papers. And unlike the tabloid scandals the palace was used to fighting, this one didn't come from a disgruntled ex-employee or a grainy photograph. It came from the machinery of global finance itself. From the paperwork. From the receipts. And inside those receipts was a name that the offshore world is simply not supposed to contain. The Duchy of Lancaster. Now, if that name means nothing to you, let me make it land, because this is the hinge the entire story turns on. The Duchy of Lancaster is a private estate, a portfolio of land and property and investments, and its whole job, for centuries, has been to generate an income for the reigning monarch. It is, in plain terms, the Queen's private purse, her personal money, separate from the taxpayer-funded working budget. And according to the leaked files, around £10 million of that private money had been placed, over the years, into funds registered offshore. In the Caymans, in Bermuda, tax havens, in the language everyone actually uses. Read that back slowly, because the paradox is the whole point. The single most British institution on the planet, the person who literally personifies the nation, whose face is on the very currency you'd use to pay your taxes, had a slice of her fortune sitting in exactly the kind of place people use to keep money at arm's length from the tax system of a country. From, in this case, her own. And here is the first thing I need you to hold, because I'm going to be careful about this the entire way through. No law was broken. Let me say it again so there's no confusion. Nothing about this was illegal. The Duchy defended the investments as completely legitimate. It pointed out that the Queen voluntarily paid tax, including on income from the Duchy, even though she was not legally required to. Offshore funds like these are used routinely and lawfully by pension schemes, universities, and institutions all over Britain, precisely because those structures can pool international investors together efficiently. On paper, on the pure question of legality, there is no crime here at all. Not a fine, not a charge, not even a technical breach. Nothing. So if there's no crime, why did it detonate the way it did? Why did this story travel around the world in a day? Because legality was never what this was about. Not for 1 second. This is the crack that opens everything. There are two completely different questions tangled up in this one story, and almost every argument you'll ever hear about it comes from mixing them up. The first question is, was it legal? And the answer, cleanly, is yes. But the second question is a different animal entirely. The second question is, what does it mean? What does it mean when the human symbol of a nation, the embodiment of Britain, its history, its supposed values, has part of her private wealth living somewhere that is very deliberately not Britain? And that second question doesn't care what the law says. Because a monarch doesn't rule on legality. A monarch rules on symbolism. That's the entire product. Strip away the symbolism, and a king or queen is just an extremely wealthy landowner with a very good hat. The whole 1,000-year trick is that the person on the throne stands for something larger than themselves, the nation, the shared story, us. So the moment her money appeared to step outside that story, even legally, even innocently, it poked a hole in the one thing the monarchy cannot afford to lose: the belief that the symbol and the substance are the same. Now let me build the ladder, because the scale of this matters, and it climbs. Start at the bottom rung, the simplest version. A private citizen invests some savings in an offshore fund. Nobody blinks. It happens every day. Boring. Step up. A wealthy public figure does it. Now, it's a little awkward, but survivable. People with money use money managers, and money managers chase returns. Still, most of the public would shrug. Step up again. A serving head of state does it. Now it stings, because a head of state is supposed to embody the public interest. And here's their private interest, quietly rooted offshore. And now the top rung, the one no other example in the world quite reaches. Not just a head of state, a hereditary monarch. Someone whose entire claim to their position is that they are Britain, in a way no elected official ever could be. A prime minister is a temporary employee of the nation. A queen, in the mythology, is the nation. And that is why this landed on her harder than it would have landed on almost anyone else alive. The higher the symbol, the further it has to fall to touch the ground. She was the highest symbol there was. And before I open the box, before I show you the specific holding that turned this from an awkward headline into something with a genuine sting, let me ask one small thing. If you want the royal story told like this, straight, with the receipts and without the fairy tale and without the pitchfork either, just tap subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd guess, and it costs you nothing. That's it. Now, the box. Here is what the reporting described, and I'm going to hedge every step of this, because the indirection is not a detail, it is the truth of the thing. The Queen did not, as far as anyone has ever suggested, sit at a desk and pick these investments. That is not how any of this works, and it's important you picture it correctly. The Duchy's money was managed by financial professionals. Some of it went into offshore funds. And those funds, in turn, held stakes in other companies, pooled together with thousands of other investors' money. So we are talking about her private estate's money, placed in a fund, which held a share of a company. 3 steps. She's at the top of that chain by title. She's almost certainly nowhere near it in practice. The idea that Elizabeth II personally knew about or approved any single one of these downstream holdings is, by every honest reading, extremely unlikely. And that matters enormously, because of what one of those downstream holdings turned out to be. According to the reporting on the Paradise Papers, a small amount of the Duchy's money, through this offshore fund, ended up invested, indirectly, in a British company that ran a rent-to-own business. A firm that sold household goods, televisions, washing machines, furniture, to people who couldn't afford to buy them outright, on weekly payment plans. The kind of business that, by its very design, tends to serve the poorest customers in the country. And that company had been publicly criticized, reported to have faced regulatory scrutiny over how it treated vulnerable customers and the true cost those customers ended up paying. Now sit with the shape of that for a second, because you don't need to exaggerate it for it to sting. The picture the story painted, fairly or not, was of the Crown's private fortune, at the very top of the food chain, with a tiny, distant, indirect thread running all the way down to a company accused of profiting from people at the very bottom of it. The symbol of the whole nation, connected by a chain of paperwork to the struggle of that nation's poorest households, however many steps apart. However, I don't know. That is the image that did the damage. Not the tax havens on their own, the destination those havens quietly pointed toward. And I want to be scrupulously fair here, because it's easy not to be. The sums involved in that specific holding were small. The connection was indirect and several layers removed. There is no evidence, none, that the Queen had any personal knowledge of it, and every reason to believe she did not. The Duchy said its investments were legitimate and that it was not involved in decisions made by funds it invested in. All of that is true, and all of it matters. But here is the uncomfortable thing symbolism does. It doesn't do subtraction. The public doesn't feel £10 million minus legality, minus indirection, minus small sums. The public feels one sentence. The Queen's money touched a company accused of squeezing the poor. And once that sentence exists, no amount of accurate, reasonable, technically correct footnotes ever quite catches up to it. That's the trap of being a symbol. The details defend the woman. They do not defend the symbol. And the monarchy trades in the symbol. So what actually happened next? This is where it gets quietly telling. Because the palace and the duchy did not come out swinging. There was no furious denial, no grand crusade. There was a careful statement noting the investments were legitimate, that all tax was voluntarily paid, that the Queen was not involved in the day-to-day. Measured, loyally, correct. And then, the oldest royal instinct there is, the desire for the whole thing to simply go quiet. To be technically answered and emotionally ignored. To wait it out. And mostly, it worked. That's the part people forget. There was no constitutional crisis. She remained beloved. The story faded from the front pages within days. But it left a residue, because it handed the monarchy's critics something they rarely get. Not a rumor, not an opinion, but a document, a receipt. Proof that the gap between the symbol and the substance was not just a theory, that it could, on paper, be measured in pounds and routed through Bermuda. And that residue is quieter and more durable than any single scandal. A tabloid headline dies when the next one prints. A document doesn't die. It sits in an archive. It gets cited. It becomes the thing people point to years later when they ask the awkward question about whether the whole arrangement is really what it claims to be. The palace can survive a bad week. What it can't easily do is unwrite a page that says, in black and white, that the money and the myth were not living in the same country. Which brings us to the two chairs. Because a story like this splits every room it enters. And I genuinely want you to pick a chair, because your answer says something real about what you think a monarchy is even for. In the first chair sits the strategist. And the strategist says, grow up. This is how large fortunes are managed everywhere on Earth. The duchy has a duty to invest its money sensibly and generate a stable income, exactly as any pension fund does. Offshore structures are legal, ordinary, and used by institutions the public trusts every day. The Queen paid her tax voluntarily when she didn't have to. She had no personal hand in a tiny, indirect holding buried 3 layers down inside a pooled fund. From this chair, the entire story is a manufactured outrage. A legal, sensible financial arrangement dressed up as a scandal because a famous name was attached. Nothing to see. Move on. In the second chair sits the believer, and the believer says, you're missing the entire point. Nobody is claiming a crime. That was never the argument. The argument is that the monarch is not a pension fund. She volunteered for a different job, to stand for the nation, to embody it, to be the one figure who is supposed to be above the ordinary game of shielding your wealth from your own country. From this chair, It was legal isn't a defense, it's a confession. It's an admission that the person who symbolizes Britain was, in her private affairs, playing by the same detached, offshore, arm's-length rules as any other rich estate. And if the symbol behaves exactly like everyone else when the money's involved, then what exactly is the symbol worth? And here's what makes it so hard. Both chairs are telling the truth. It can be completely legal and completely reasonable as finance, and still quietly corrosive as symbolism. Those two things are not in contradiction. They're just answering different questions. So I want to know where you land. Tell me in the comments. Chair 1 or Chair 2? Is this a non-story invented by people who don't understand how money works? Or is no law broken exactly the problem? The moment the symbol of Britain quietly banked like everyone else. I read them, and on this one, I think the split is going to be sharp. Now sit for a moment in the strangest, quietest part of this whole story. Because notice who wasn't really in the room to defend her. The Queen herself said almost nothing. That was the role. That was always the role. The silence was the dignity. The Duchy issued its careful lines and receded. And the offshore world, the funds and the firms and the managers who actually built these structures and made these choices, don't hold press conferences. They don't stand on a balcony. When the story broke, it broke on a name, hers. And the actual architects of it were nowhere the cameras could reach. She got the headline, they kept their anonymity. That's the deal a symbol makes without ever signing it. You get the crown, and you also get every consequence that anyone can pin to your name, including the ones made by people you never met. 3 steps down a chain you never read. She was the most recognized human being on the planet. And in the one story where the paperwork spoke louder than she ever could, there was no one who could truly stand up and make it disappear. Because the thing under scrutiny wasn't a rumor to be denied. It was a document to be explained. And you cannot deny a document. You can only survive it. So here's where we're left. And here's the question I can't put down. She's gone now, and I want to be respectful of that. She carried her role for 70 years with a discipline almost nobody could match. And the offshore holdings were a footnote in a very long life, not its headline. That's fair, and it's true. But the question the Paradise Papers cracked open didn't die with her. It just passed to the throne behind her. Because the machinery is still there. The duchy is still there. The private fortune, the professional managers, the funds, the whole quiet architecture. It all continues, under a new name, under a new reign. So the real question was never really about one woman and £10 million in Bermuda. The real question is the one that outlives every monarch who ever sits on that chair. Can you be the living symbol of a nation, while a part of your fortune quietly lives somewhere that is very deliberately not that nation? Legally, the answer is yes. But that was never the question that mattered. So tell me below, do you think this ended when the headlines faded? Or is the gap this leak exposed, between the symbol on the throne and the money behind the curtain, still sitting there right now, legal, quiet, and waiting for the next document to turn it back into a question nobody in the palace wants to answer? Because I don't think we've seen the last page of this. And whatever surfaces next, you and I are going to sit down and read it together. So I'll see you in the next one.